And when we've had some time for Q&A, we'll then look at going into breakout rooms to kind of continue this conversation. I'm going to stop sharing now so I can see all of you. Super. So yeah, I haven't looked in the chat. Feel free to put questions in there. And Laura has also shared in the chat the link to where you'll be able to find her scribes as well. I know it always takes a moment for people to articulate their questions, and but don't be shy.
Hannah, hi, it's David Kemisbetti. We met at King's and Sandhurst and various other places, I think.
Yeah, nice to hear from you.
So yeah, I'm the policy desk in the Land Operations Command for Human Security, CIMIC, and obviously working very closely with the outreach group in 11 Security Force Assistance Brigade. This issue hasn't really been on the agenda much over the last few years, except really with Mali, where we've had sort of 250, 300 troops, obviously no longer there, but we certainly didn't, try female engagement teams or even really mixed engagement teams. What we did do, though, is we had female points of presence, and the commanders on the ground were keen to obviously be aware of the females that they have on the ground and to use those to engage female to female. They were doing a fairly specialist unit, specialist role as a long range reconnaissance group operating in the deserts, but then tipping up into sort of villages and in the middle of nowhere, and they found it useful, engaging, using the women that they had on the ground, that were usually specialists, military police, or perhaps said gunners or medics or whatever, intelligence corps, and they were also able at times to pool the women together to set up a meeting, say a key leader engagement with a group of women to discuss what they felt about the key issues that that they were concerned about, which is mainly security. It's also tied to the issue of us trying to meet the UN targets for women in peacekeeping, which are growing every year towards 15% of the contingent meant to be being female by 2028. The trouble, of course, that we have with that is that we don't force generate people. We try and force generate without focusing on gender, and we don't prioritize gender because women come into the army as gunners or aircraft mechanics or intelligence specialists or military police or infanteers or gunners or engineers or whatever. They don't come in as women, and we don't tend to use them as women. But there is obviously evidence from the past that we have used women to engage with women, and particularly in countries where women are hidden away and where male to female engagement can be difficult. Using women to engage with 50% of the population obviously has a massive operational benefit for information exchange and understanding the local population, etc. There isn't really an experiment, having Mali having finished, we don't have an operational theatre necessarily to experiment and keep this going right at the moment, other than sort of STTs, training teams out in various places around the world. There's no sort of large-scale operation other than the UN operation in Cyprus, which gets almost no female engagement because it gets almost no engagement with the locals, full stop, on the line of control in Cyprus. But you know, I think this is useful research for the future, because we are, you know, we don't know what's around the corner next and when we might end up in a conflict. Obviously, the focus of the British Army at the moment is mainly on preparing for war fighting, but you know, we could end up in another stabilization, peacekeeping operation, counterinsurgency, etc., around the corner at some stage, in a country where the females are you know, hidden behind doors or behind burqas or whatever, and don't naturally want to engage with male soldiers. I think what I would really caution against, and I find this a lot in the WPS narrative, is a tendency to bang on about the masculine domain and the patriarchal culture, and slightly to bash, I'm not saying you have, but to bash the men. The way to change the male culture of being a sort of macho culture is not to tell them that they're all evil, horrible, patriarchal people, but to sort of try and bring them along. So, you know, further research in this work area needs to bring the men with them, with the argument, and not to bash men, as it were, because otherwise it won't change. But you know, I'd be really interested to obviously to read the full report, and then to sort of have probably a proper sort of long discussion about how we take it forward with Land Warfare Centre and doctrine, and you know, for future operations. But the trouble, as ever, is you know, if we're going to form female engagement teams, there's got to be a really specific operational requirement for them, because you take a woman, to form a female engagement team, you have to take them from certain sort of other units, and those losing units then have to stand a gap, and then or they have to find women from other places, you know, to stand that, to fill those gaps. So you know, generally we're trying to increase the number of women across the armed forces, but generally in most units deploying on operations, there are relatively small numbers of women, particularly in ground-close combat. And it may be that it stays that way for a very long time, or forever, because most men don't want to be in ground-close combat because it's extremely hard work and tough life. And so an awful lot of women also won't necessarily want to be in that sort of world. Some will, and some are more than capable of obviously being there in their own right. But it's a really interesting and sort of challenging topic, and there is definitely an operational requirement for it under certain circumstances, and definitely welcome the conversation, and keen to carry it on, as it were. I'll stop there for timing.
Thank you for those comments. So just to follow up on some of what you've said there, I would, you know, really want to stress that the brief is not about advocating for female engagement teams. It's about having a conversation that sees female engagement teams as a way of looking at two things: looking at gendered military cultures, and what that means. As I mentioned early on in the presentation, one of the important things I'm trying to do through this research is acknowledge that in delivering gendered policies, that has to be done by also looking at the organization internally and what's the cultures within that organization. So I think what's happened, certainly in the literature and in the research up to now, is that those two things are looked at as two quite separate areas. So you've got work that looks at diversity and inclusion and HR and this kind of research and literature. And that's completely isolated from work relating to operational policies and practice. And I think that you can't possibly implement a policy that has any relation to gender. I'm not just talking about female engagement teams, human security advisors, anything in that domain, without having some connection with the institution itself and how its own cultures. So I think that's a really important part of this research. Another aspect that I wanted to follow up on is about the history. So I think that female engagement teams offer a really interesting insight, but what I'm trying to do with them and with this brief is demonstrate that they, by looking at them, we can see that, and as we look back, as I have done in my wider research, back to Northern Ireland, back to Malaya, that there is this history of women's involvement, both women's involvement in the military, also women's involvement in human security domain over this long period of time. And that has been written out, that history has been put in different places. So, for example, in Malaya, Lady Templar that I mentioned briefly, her work, obviously she wasn't in uniform at the time, but it was very similar to the sort of work that was going on by the PRT 70 years later. But that work has been written out because it was involved the British Red Cross and the Women's Institute, even though General Templar, who was the military lead at the time in this operation, even though he saw it as part of the military mission, that has been put somewhere else. So if service women now look back at their sort of heritage of 70 years plus of women's military history, that isn't seen as part of it. It doesn't contribute to that story. And I think that very often, as I've seen with female engagement teams, and I believe I'm seeing happen again with human security advisors, that these initiatives are seen as if they are entirely new and there's no sort of history. They're just a new initiative that's happened. And that is the reason that you end up with what I call in my PhD thesis, a sort of sawtooth effect. So that there tends to be quite a popular history that women's integration in the military is at one of ever increasing proximity to the front line, and that's just been a steady progress over time. But actually, looking at the campaigns I've looked at, you can see that during the campaign, there's an increase in women's involvement, but then at the end of that campaign, that tends to be written out, and then a new campaign, it sort of starts again. And I think that is very much the case in this human security domain, where you can see female engagement teams get ever increasing interest during the Afghanistan conflict, but then kind of that drops afterwards. And then you've got human security advisors picking up now, even though there is, female engagement teams as a term kind of does continue. I also just wanted, just adding to the points about patriarchal military cultures, I think that's interesting, your comments, and actually this I did briefly mention my sort of future research plans, which are to bring some of these findings and this dynamic that I found through my research, which isn't the subject of the brief today, but is the wider context it sits in, which is looking at the kind of bargain, I argue through the research, a bargain between the military as an institution. This isn't about individual men or women in any sort of command positions. This is just as a culture that of the institution that drives this gender dynamic that leads to spaces and of the front line, for example, as becoming this sort of maintaining this history of being a male sort of space, which affects the narratives that are constructed around women's presence in relation to them. And I could talk more, I won't, because it's not the subject of today's brief, but about how that applied specifically in Northern Ireland around various constructions of narratives to do with women's presence. I can see I've got some more questions in the chat here that I'll move to as well. Heloise is asking about, could I comment on what I think the reason was behind the two different narratives for FETS, the internal narrative and the external narrative? Was that deliberate or the consequence of different narrative creators? So this, for anyone that sort of missed the beginning, was talking about the need for an internal narrative where the army employed the argument that they were that FETs were contributing to operational effectiveness and bringing kind of military utility, and to an external audience, the idea of FETs as fitting in with narratives of protecting and empowering Afghan women that fitted in more with the rhetoric, the political rhetoric for the intervention in the first place. In terms of how that came about, I think you can see this in numerous other policies and initiatives in the military context. The need to adhere to operational effectiveness as a kind of argument in times where finances are stretched, people are stretched, in order to bring resource to something. That operational effectiveness argument is a very strong one. And in fact, Robert Egnell has written a lot about this in the context of, I can't remember which military now off the top of my head, but non-British military, and how important that argument is. I think it's the pressure of having to satisfy both an internal audience in terms of needing to bring this policy into practice, that means that that is a convenient and easily sellable argument, but at the same time there are pressures on the military institution in the public domain, which leads to these this need to also have this external argument that fits in with sort of public political media narratives. More questions here. Thank you for these. Megan has asked about how the FETs are or are not being used currently by the UK and other NATO militaries, and is the model still being actively promoted? Has it morphed into METs, or METs being mixed engagement teams, or only the human security advisors? I think we have sort of touched on that a little bit, and I recognise I'm not the best placed in terms of the very latest use of them, but my understanding is that the term FETs has kind of been used in parallel with the mixed engagement teams for some time, and in the interactions I hear both of those terms used occasionally, but tending to be used more in relation to troop contributing nations that British human security advisors are working with, so that it's other nations who are providing the people to enact these teams, and it's the human security advisors that I've interviewed who have talked about working with those nations. So that's my understanding of sort of the latest, but that has been, as we mentioned, David mentioned, in terms of the operations in Mali, and through my own interviews, that's been more around the operations in the DRC. And a second question from Megan about the pressure for good news stories and reporting back from the FETs. Does that dynamic continue to exist in wider work to do with human security, pushing for narratives showing good work is being done without necessarily robust impact evaluation? How do we evaluate impact? I think that's a really great question, and I think that I do see a lot of the issues that I've raised through this brief. I see those repeating themselves in my interactions with the human security advisors. I think that would be quite an interesting question as we kind of continue this conversation, to maybe talk about as we go into the breakout rooms. I think there will be others who are more actively involved in human security advisors training and policies right now, who might be able to contribute more to that. Or in fact, we may have a number of, in fact, I know we have got some human security advisors who've been through that training and deployed doing that, who might be able to comment on it as well. But I would expect that some of these similar patterns are being repeated. I'm conscious you're hearing my voice kind of constantly here. I'm just reading off questions. If anyone wants to actually ask a question by speaking it to break that up, then do feel free to put your hands up. I'm sort of just working through the list. Gretchen has asked, did anything come up in your research about the recent diffusion of the FET-MET model into UN peacekeeping and non-Western militaries? Zimbabwe is one example I'm aware of. I think really that question, I can't add a great deal more than what I just said in relation to Megan's question in terms of how those are still being used. My PhD research really stopped at the sort of 2014 point as the FETs transitioned to, at the time in the Afghan context, to the cultural advisors. However, I did continue, because at one stage I'd planned to continue right up to contemporary operations. So I did do a series of interviews with a number of human security advisors, and haven't yet published that work, but hope to soon. So I have more of an understanding of that, of how it continued in the early days of the human security advisors, where there were quite different experiences, tour on tour, I think, and that was all in the context of the DRC, and not beyond that. Oh yeah, practical logistical question there. I'm sorry if anyone missed or wasn't able to get in earlier on to the talk, so I have recorded all of it, so you will be able to share that with everyone. And Pete Chilvers, hi Pete, is asking about whether there are any training courses being run on this in any of the defence training establishments and schools around the world. A number listed there, so perhaps that's something we could take into the conversation as we go into breakout rooms and see if that's something we can feed back. The idea with this next section is that we'll go into breakout rooms, but we also have a Google Jamboard. I know that sounds a bit whizzy, but it's just like a virtual whiteboard basically, which I'll show you how it works, and we can contribute to that. So it will be a nice way. I know there's lots and lots of expertise in the virtual space we have here, so it will be nice to share some of that. Katie has a question. Would you like?
Hi, Hannah. Thank you very much for the brief, and apologies if this sounds like a silly question, but I was looking at your recommendations, obviously quite strategic level. I just wondered what your thought would be on bringing it back down almost to the tactical level of recommendations, especially considering the obviously the areas you identified, that the visibly welcomed and visibly undermined element, and almost making it a role within each unit to have a FET, but not to obviously undermine the purpose of it. I know that you have your fire safety officer, your DE and everything. I wondered if, I was just curious what your thoughts would be if that's potentially a way forward, and especially acknowledging how busy Outreach are already and their lack of resourcing in the regular forces. But
yeah, thank you.
Thanks
for that. Yeah, to me, I think yeah, like you said, you know, the recommendations are at that more strategic level, because I think the thing that I think is the most important is to find the space and the time for these conversations. I think to go to the, whilst I'll talk briefly about some of those more tactical level questions, I think the important thing here is that it will be very hard to implement, as the research has shown, it's very hard to implement these kind of policies if you're constrained in some way by the culture, the prevailing culture, in terms of how you know, how that is received and integrated. So I think it's super important to address these things, which is why I'm sort of shifting my research direction, because I think that's, you know, that's really, really important to see these gendered policies in that light and fit them into their long history and into their institutional cultural context. So I think they are my kind of big messages. But I think if I was looking at the tactical level, probably the top thing that came out of all of the interviews that I did was around the doctrine and the knowing what the purpose of it was. And I was involved in some of those discussions. You know, you can work out from the timings I was talking about of being involved in those initial discussions and contributing to some of that conversation at the time. But I think that the doctrine note I mentioned, there were other working papers at the time, but specifically the doctrine note, I think you know, that didn't reach the people it needed to reach, but it also didn't, you know, not enough conversation was able to happen at that point to really identify what the purpose was. And that came through really strongly in the interviews, that people didn't really know what part of a female engagement team, but they didn't really know what they were supposed to be doing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hannah. Appreciate that. Thank you.
And Rachel?
Hi, Hannah. Thank you very much for your presentation. I am an SO1 CIMIC, so I sit within outreach group and work closely with the Human Security branch. And actually, a reservist colleague sent me the link to the presentation because she knew it would be of interest. So thanks very much. I guess my question really is in terms of kind of holistic. You said this wasn't about kind of reinvigorating female engagement teams, and it was kind of a holistic gendered policy. From a CIMIC perspective, one of the challenges we have in terms of representation is exactly that. It's getting CIMIC teams represented throughout the army and defence, because we know the benefits that gives us, in theatres. And actually, within a CIMIC team, you've usually got females, you've got human security advisors, you've got all those people that do the interaction that in Afghanistan theatre, the female engagement teams were doing. And really, so it's, I guess, thinking about kind of how times have changed. And David made a very valid point in terms of since the Afghanistan, when female engagement teams were prevalent, females are now in the infantry, they're now in the cavalry. A lot of things have changed in terms of structure. And thinking in terms of theatre, and outreach are doing some work with the Ukrainians in terms of training for CIMIC and including human security. And actually the theatre is very different. And now, Ukraine, we're looking at a society that's not segregated. We're looking at, a much higher number of women actually in the military. So actually, female engagement teams is not so relevant. But what is hugely relevant is that CIMIC aspect from our perspective. So I was just wondering, in terms of your work and it feeding into policies, I absolutely see the need for there to be females in teams. But I kind of a question in terms of the approach. Is there a risk that we kind of have silos of policies, trying to push something through, when actually is it more holistic? It's more about, recruiting, it's getting more females in the army in general. And from kind of an outreach perspective, it's getting CIMIC and human security at the forefront, and by doing kind of what we're doing in any case. So that's really just to throw that out there, because I'm really interested in how, guys, your work feeds into kind of a more holistic approach across the board, and obviously coming from a CIMIC perspective.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think perhaps that's a point. I'm just about to sort of switch to opening this conversation up more. So I think that might be a nice point to take into the ongoing conversation. But I think, just repeating some of those points about the importance of seeing the work, gendered work in this domain in terms of its history. And I'm sorry if I'm sort of repeating myself a bit, but just seeing the long history of women's participation and where that has, where some of that story has been lost, and understanding what the relationship is between women's integration in the military over time, gendered cultures in the military, and what that relationship is with these policies now. Just find through this research, but also more contemporary conversations, that those areas are often isolated and not connected up. And I think unless we see those connections, we're not able to really have a conversation that is holistic and connects all those things up. So that is probably quite a good point to kind of close on the Q&A, although very happy to, there might be time at the end for any more if you think of them. And what I'd like to do now is invite people to smaller breakout rooms where there'll just be a chance to have a chat about this research and what it sort of means for you in your different worlds. I know we've got a really great cross-section of thanks, everyone. Great to see you. Thanks for being brave and putting things on the the Jamboard. That was good to see that developing. I hope you've all had good conversations. I kind of feel sad that I've missed some of that. But I think we've got a little bit of an opportunity now. If anybody wants to share live any comments or feedback from the discussion they've had, if I can ask that you just keep it brief, but any key points from the groups, and then we're going to go to Laura, who's going to talk us through the scribes she's been doing based on your notes that you put down there. Any thoughts or comments that anyone wants to share live?
I can jump in, David Kirby again. I think we obviously we are trying to learn the lessons from Mali, but that's now finished, and the other UN operation we have, there's almost no engagement on the line, so it's little to learn from there in Cyprus. But I think we should try to learn lessons from. I gather Zambians are training female engagement teams, and BPST are doing training of local units to go to the Somali operation, and so Somalia, I think, is an area of interest where we should be extracting lessons, and also other UN operations or Africa Union operations around the globe. But trying to pull those lessons into doctrines in preparation for future conflict that we may get involved in. But I would just caution that some of the lessons coming out of other nations, such as African nations or sort of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, doing UN peacekeeping operations, they find, finding women to be FETs or METs a lot easier than we do. So there's this fourth generation challenges, which has sort of an impact on the individual or the unit that's providing the women to form a FET or a MET, which I think we will always sort of for the time being find challenging, whereas other units, other countries don't find it so challenging.
Thanks for that. And does anyone else have anything to share from any of the other groups? I thought it was really interesting looking at the comments as they were coming in, particularly hearing from about parallels. I'm interested in my future research in looking at the implications of my work on gendered military cultures and how that applies to other institutions, whether that's other uniformed forces, but also other kind of industries and sectors themselves. So I was particularly interested in the comment somebody put about learning and parallels with the police. And also across different militaries. Obviously, some comments there about US examples as well. Before I hand over to Laura, I just wanted to say as well, obviously we'll be sending out a copy of the scribes and the recording and the brief itself to everyone who signed up. But also please stay in touch. I know that there's a real diversity of people who've signed up. I know that some are from different militaries or different research areas. So if you if you're involved in this area, and I only just see your email address and that you've signed up, so do ping me an email. I'll put my email in the chat as well, and because it'd be great to kind of carry on this conversation. But Laura, if I can hand over to you to talk through your scribes, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. As you can see on the screen here, we've got your scribes, but I'm going to go back a step to here, which is an overview of Hannah's research and also the brief as well. Let me just turn off one of these there. So we have that kind of overview of Hannah's exploration of women's experiences of British counter-insurgency campaigns, and that data looking at 36 interviews, policy papers, and also autoethnographic reflections, and looking specifically at female engagement teams. And we looked very briefly at kind of the brief history of the FETs, from the kind of affairs agenda to the introduction in the US, then the kind of ISAF on the FETs, and also then how that's morphed into this cultural advisor role. And then those key findings centered around this idea of visibly welcomed but invisible undermined. So that first kind of key finding being around the confusion around the FET role itself, with unclear aims, tensions in ownership, and also this constant state of trial. And secondly, then this impressive few versus the incompetent many. So this challenge of poor training and a lack of resource to ensure that FETs could do their jobs as well as possible. And then it's thinking about how women kind of framed as weapons and tools rather than warriors. So how they were deployed as almost this ammunition, if you like, rather than being seen as part of that wider soldier force. And also how then participation was negotiated too, with then those kind of two core recommendations being around how can we evaluate the concept of the FET? So what does it mean? What's its purpose? And what can we learn from the last few years around this? But also then how do we exchange knowledge around these learnings between different militaries, across different campaigns too? And then we've had a discussion briefly here around what our reflections on the research are and those implications. So some of those reflections around it's useful to understand the kind of this culture of masculinity in relation to recruitment efforts for women. But then on the flip side of that is talking about patriarchy in this way, kind of alienating to men. How do we bring men alongside and along with women on this discussion, this journey? And then a bit more clarity around whether the research is improvement and focusing on improvement of FETs or this sort of critique. So which side of the coin are we on? And then these parallels between the UK and USA, and also what we can learn from other kinds of forces. So the police, for example. And those implications are, the important historical context that this research provides, and opportunities to improve practice, whilst also learning from different conflicts and different militaries. And then also this need for FET training standards. How can we take that forward as well? And all of these illustrations will be uploaded to the link that I'm just posting on the screen now, and really looking forward to hearing the rest of the discussion when you might have it over email. Thanks, Hannah.
Super. Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks everyone for your time. I'll be hanging around if anyone's got any final questions, but thanks all for coming and also getting involved in the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Hannah. Best of luck.
Thank you.